We are taught from an early age, either implicitly or explicitly, that the way to become greater is by getting more. We are taught that getting more education will make us smarter. We are taught getting more money will make us richer. We are taught getting more friends and associates will make us popular. And the list goes on and on. And so then our lives become a rat race wherein we attempt to accumulate as much as we can, be it power, be it prestige, or be it popularity. Our lives in this way then get reduced to what we can attain rather than on what we can achieve, focusing on our hands and our heads while leaving our hearts behind. We are taught that to become great, what you have has to become greater. We are taught either explicitly or implicitly, in order to be greater, we must consume, compete, and compare. But beloved, John shows us something radically different in the text today. John does something and says something that is completely unexpected and unprecedented. John is literally and figuratively eclipsed by the sun, that is the S-O-N. Instead of attempting to get out from behind him, instead of attempting to get in front of him, instead of attempting to block him, even at the beck and call of John's own disciples, John pointedly and purposely declares these oft-quoted words from the Holy Writ, that he must increase, but I must decrease. Beloved, John shows us something that we ought to consider this Lord's Day, that the way to truly becoming and to truly experiencing greater, at least from a biblical and a gospel standpoint, flips everything that we've been taught about greater on its head. If we're really real about it, what John does and what John says flies in the face of our natural instincts. After all, how many of us, when confronted with competition, just naturally give way? How many of us, when threatened by somebody else, just tuck tail and back down? How many of us, when pushed out of the way, just happily move out of the way? After all, what do you do when you used to be the hot shot on the block, but now your life has cooled and you're not so hot so more? What do you do when what you've been known for, now somebody else does better? What do you do when what they used to come to you for, they now go to the person that you trained? Beloved, these are not easy questions to answer. And they are certainly not easy problems to have to deal with. And these questions, these conundrums, these problems, more than other, in potentially very painful ways, force us to reckon with who we really are. That most important things in our life, that we often spend the most time building around with things we can amass instead of building on with things eternal. Here John shows us that just because he's God's preacher and prophet, that doesn't make him immune or exempt to what each of us will inevitably be confronted with in this life, that perhaps what seems so obvious isn't so obvious. The way to greater is not by greater, but perhaps the way to greater is through lesser. That the way to increase is to decrease. That the way up is actually down. That in the words of John, Christ must increase, but I must decrease. So then the question that we must wrestle with today, even as we focus in again on our vision of greater for this year, the question we have to wrestle with today is, in a world and in a way of living where we've been conditioned to believe and to behave in ways that in order to be greater, we have to increase everything about ourselves and to protect it at all costs. The critical question, the relevant question, our life's question that each of us will have to answer is, how will I choose to decrease so that Christ must increase? Well, beloved, if the text be true, if the text is to be trusted, if the text is to be tried, and I believe it to be so, if Christ is going to be increased, and on the other hand, if you are going to be decreased, you have to first realize, number one, it's about commission, not competition. After Jesus is baptized by John in the Jordan, after Jesus commences his earthly ministry in Galilee, after Jesus calls his disciples, after Jesus turns water into wine at Cana, and after Jesus flips the tables in the temple in Jerusalem. After all of this, the Bible records here in John chapter 3, verse 22, that Jesus and his disciples go out to the Judean countryside. Jesus spends time with them. I like the way the King James puts it. It says he tarries with them. And there we have recorded that Jesus baptized. That Jesus starts his own ministry of baptism. Now remember, that's John's thing. After all, it's so much John's thing that it's a part of John's name. Who is he? John the Baptist. And now Jesus, who John baptized, starts his own ministry of baptism. And watch the text. John's disciples get word of this, and they come to him and say, verse 26, Rabbi, the one who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you testified, here he is baptizing, and all are going out to him. Here's an aside for you. It's never as bad as they say it is. Always beware of absolute statements. Because read the text. All were going to be baptized by Jesus. Verse 23 lets us know, and people kept coming and were being baptized by John, because John, of course, had not yet been in prison. But nevertheless, even though Jesus began his own ministry and John still had his, John's disciples had this competition mindset. They came to John with this mess that Jesus, the one who John baptized, is now baptizing others and doing it at the expense and popularity of John. John's disciples come to John like this, ain't Jesus your guy? Didn't you baptize him? And now he got the nerve to start baptizing everybody else where you did it? What you gonna do, John? But watch how John responds. Verse 27, no one can receive anything except what has been given from heaven. In other words, John says what the Miami Mass Choir picked up thousands of years later, that what God has for me, it is for me. And on the flip side, what God has for somebody else is for somebody else. John reminds us that in the kingdom of God, there is no competition, but there is only commission. That while we all share the commonality that we have all been created by God in the same image of God, each of us has been uniquely and differently and various commissioned by God to do something that nobody else but you can do. Beloved, there is no competition. We're all running for the same prize. And it's going to be the same prize for each of us, no matter who gets there first. And let me help somebody. There is no such thing as winners and losers in the kingdom of God. Let me help you. We all win. There are no gold, silver, or bronze medals. We all just have a cross. That if we're faithful enough to the task of carrying, that one day we'll trade it for a crown. Beloved, just put a dime in the meter and pause for the cause for a second and let your mind go back outside the sanctuary, into your home, onto your job, out in these streets, and think about all the problems that are in those places. Take a moment and think about it. Now come back to the sanctuary. You saw all those problems? There are too many problems that this world needs God's people to solve, that there isn't time, space, or opportunity for us to compete with one another. The story is told of a battalion who fought in World War I. At one point in the war, this particular battalion saved the line. They were so proud of themselves for accomplishing such a major feat. Seeking to revel in their glory, they waited for the newspapers back home to report the news. When the newspapers made it back to their base, they saw that the journalist had made a mistake. And the feat they accomplished was accredited to another battalion who was miles away from the site, and their specific battalion was never mentioned at all. All the soldiers fell silent, and even the colonel's face dropped, and it flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Then the colonel's head popped up, and the colonel said, "What does it matter, gentlemen? What does it matter who gets the credit for it? We know who did it." You see, John's disciples were worried that Jesus was stealing John's shine. They were worried, put in a modern day text, they were worried that Jesus was stealing John's members. That Jesus was stealing John's job. That John's disciples were so caught up on a minuscule point that they couldn't see the bigger picture. Just like that battalion, what does it matter who gets the credit for it? All that matters is that it was done. What does it matter that people get baptized by John or by Jesus? The point is, they got baptized. Church, that's why I don't trip about other pastors and other churches with bigger buildings, bigger budgets, and bigger number of butts in the seats. There are too many people in this world who don't know Jesus. And the more people we all get to meet Jesus, who cares who gets the glory? What matters is if they get saved. As James Altucher says, your competition is not other people, but your competition is the time you kill, the ill will you create, the knowledge you neglect to learn, the connections you fail to build, the health you sacrifice along the path, your inability to generate ideas, the people around you who don't support and love your efforts, and whatever God you curse for your bad luck. Because, beloved, no doubt about it, there is something you will do in this life. But the question is, will what you do be what God commissioned for you to do? Or will it be because you wanted to compete with others and still failed? And if Christ is going to be increased, and if you are going to be decreased, you have to first realize that not only is it about commission, what God commissioned you to do, and not competition, but secondly, you have to realize it's about complementing, not comparing. When John's disciples come to him trying to start some mess, John not only says in verse 27 that no one can receive anything except what has been given from heaven, that is, what God has for me, it is for me. John takes it a step further in verse 28. He says, "You yourselves are my witnesses that I said, I am not the Messiah, but I have been sent ahead of him." You see, church, if you're not careful, other people and places around you will put expectations on you that you don't have for you, and that God doesn't even have for you. And when we put unfair, and dare I say even ungodly, that is not of God, expectations on ourselves, we fall into the enemy's trap of comparing ourselves to each other instead of operating in God's plan to complement each other. This is what happens when we see somebody else operating in the fullness of who God commissioned them to be, and we're not operating in the fullness of who God commissioned us to be. You see, when we do that, we have no choice but to compare, and our comparison leads us to see the other party as a threat, even though they're not. that we end up forfeiting our own promise, trying to get somebody else's, selling our birthright for a bowl of lentils. Because remember, while we share in the commonality that God created each of us in the same image of His, God commissioned each of us differently, uniquely, and variedly. And God's commission of us, not people's comparison of us, ought to be what drives our life's work. Beloved, John knew who John was. He was the one who needed to prepare the way for the Lord, not the one to be the Lord, and definitely not to be the one to get in the Lord's way. John imposes upon us a crucial question, and that is, what has God commissioned you to do? How has God uniquely gifted you? What has God told you to do that He hasn't told anybody else to do? What has God said to you about you that only you know for yourself? Problem is, at best, we don't take time to ponder these things in our hearts. Or at worst, we don't tap into God's courage to complete the assignment of who God has commissioned us to be. And we end up taking on work that is not ours in comparison. And we end up trying, although failing, to be a carbon copy of somebody else, because that's easier than being the one and only original who God commissioned you to be. Hear the words of Dr. Raymond Barber that he writes to preachers in his book entitled Profile of a Preacher. He says, and this can apply to all of us whether you're a preacher or not, don't be guilty of comparing your accomplishments or performances with those of anybody else. To do so is to lessen your own effectiveness. To do so is to frustrate the grace of God. You are you, and to attempt to become more is to become less. And when our lives become about comparisons to each other instead of compliments with each other, life becomes joyless. You all remember what President Teddy Roosevelt said, that comparison is the thief of joy. I don't know about you, sisters and brothers, but life is hard enough. Life is rough enough. Life is tough enough to go through it without joy, because I took it away from myself. Because like we sing, this joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me and the world can't take it away. That is true. But guess what? Guess who can take away your joy? You can. And you do it, we do it when we compare ourselves to each other, when we fail to realize that life is like a highway. That we're all headed to the same destination. We all have to drive on the same service road. We all have to turn up on an on ramp, and we all have to merge into traffic on the highway. And you can choose to either get stuck still on the ramp because you're so afraid and paralyzed by comparison, thinking that other cars are moving way faster than you ever could, now realizing that you're a car too. Like a Ford, God built you for the road ahead. And even if you're a putt-putt or a pinto, that you can still get to where you're going if you push yourself hard enough. And if you time yourself well enough to merge on in, you can really get in where you fit in. When you get in where you fit in, thirdly and finally, you can realize that in order for Christ to be increased, in order for you to decrease, experience the greater God has for you, you realize it's about commission, not competition. You realize it's about complimenting, not comparing. But thirdly and finally, you realize it's about completing, not compromising. John gives us a real-life example here from his time to illustrate this reality. But in order to experience God's greater for you, you must decrease so that Christ must increase. John says in verse 29, he who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. John says, "For this reason my joy has been fulfilled. He must increase, but I must decrease." John's illustration here is that of a wedding. Don't make it deeper than what it is. He identifies himself not as the bridegroom, but he identifies himself as a friend of the bridegroom. Similar to what we would call a best man. As a friend to the bridegroom, he would be responsible for bringing the bride to the groom so that the wedding could go on as planned. And having made sure that the bride gets to the groom for the wedding, the friend of the bridegroom's job is complete. And now the focus moves from the friend getting her to the aisle to the couple who stand at the altar ready to get married. Take this illustration a step further. Historians say there is good evidence. According to ancient Mesopotamian law, the friend of the bridegroom was forbidden under any circumstance to marry the bride, even if the groom rejected her. Meaning that even if your boy doesn't marry his girl and breaks up with her, that she's still not fair game. And it would be foul play for you to try to dribble in her court. In other words, what John is trying to say is focus on the God in you. Focus on completing your God-given assignment. Focus on fulfilling your God-given mission. Focus on doing what God told you to do, nothing more and nothing less. Because stepping outside of what God commissioned you to do will cause you to live beneath the promise for your life. So watch this, put it all together. As one commentator puts it, unlike John's jealous disciples, John found great joy in phasing out so that Jesus' ministry could receive all attention. Having brought him the bride, the faithful friend of the bridegroom rejoices greatly because he hears the groom's voice expressing joy over the bride. So John's joy was made full as he watched the crowds leave him and go to Jesus. Beloved, I'm in my seat now, but as I titled this message, all I've come to tell you is that less is more. And the way to experience greater in your life is exactly how John said it. Christ must increase, but you and I must decrease. Church, I come to tell you that you'll never have joy doing more than what you're supposed to do. John shows us we must be about our commission, not about competition. John shows us we must be about complimenting each other, not about comparing ourselves to each other. John shows us we must be about completing what God wants us to do, not compromising and making concessions on who God has made us to be. So if you want greater in your life, you ought to agree with John here in the text. And you ought to say less of me and more of you. And exactly what are you saying less of and more to? You see, when you pray that prayer, that Christ must increase, but I must decrease, you're saying less of my hate in my heart and more of his heart for love. When you say less of me and more of you, you're talking about less of your languishing and more of his love. You see, when you pray this prayer like John, that Christ must increase, but I must decrease, you're praying that less of my doubt and more of his deliverance. You see, when you pray that prayer, you're praying less of my fear, but more of his faithfulness. You see, when you pray that prayer, that Christ increase, but I must decrease. You're saying less of my pain, but more of his peace. You're saying less of my sickness and more of his healing. You see, church, when you pray that prayer, that Christ must increase and that I must decrease. You're praying less of my poverty